Hello everyone and welcome to Tomorrow's Tech, brought to you by 3.digital. Our goal is to help entrepreneurs and industry leaders successfully develop and commercialise their technology innovations. Today we welcome Malcolm McBratney, a partner at the national law firm Mills Oakley and an experienced lawyer in corporate, commercial, intellectual property and technology law. He is very passionate about helping startups lay the foundations. Welcome, Malcolm.
Thanks, Rosie.
Malcolm, when is it the right time for entrepreneurs to start investing in their IP?
Startup founders and entrepreneurs really need to be making conscious decisions about intellectual property right from the beginning. There's different types of IP: copyright, patents, trademarks, designs and other rights. Copyright comes into existence pretty much automatically, and it protects things such as writing, artistic works and software. Other rights such as patents, trademarks and designs, however, are registered rights, and you need to take active steps to actually apply for those rights. So trademarks you can be a little more relaxed about because you can do that at any time, although earlier is better. Patents and designs, however, they have very strict timing issues in relation to them, and most importantly, you need to keep the invention or the design confidential before you file the application. If you don't do that, then the application will be invalid. So those are issues you do need to think about. You might not decide to file a patent or a design, but you want to make that decision yourself rather than have it made for you by inadvertently disclosing or commercialising it before the relevant date. There is a grace period in relation to patents. It's a 12-month one, but it's not in every country around the world, and importantly, it's not in Europe. Designs don't even have a grace period, although they're thinking about putting one in place in Australia. So conscious decisions up front is what startup founders need to be doing.
Great insights, Malcolm. Malcolm, what are the three key things that startup founders need to consider right at the beginning of their journey that could later impact the value of their IP?
Well, the first one is to look before you leap. The amount of times that a simple Google search would have shown that the name that you're choosing for your business somebody already has astounds me.
Right.
So you need to look that you're not infringing someone else's IP with your new business or your new business idea. And in that respect, I'm talking about the name and the logo, and some simple searches can be done there. But also, depending what you're doing, potentially you might actually want to be searching the patent and design registers to make sure there's not some IP rights there. You'll probably need some professional assistance to do that. So look before you leap. The second one, and probably the most important one, is making sure you own the IP. It actually seems pretty obvious, but the chain of title to the IP is the most common problem that I come across when I'm looking at intellectual property issues. Bear in mind, if you're looking to get investment or sell the business in due course, someone like me will be employed to go and look at the IP pretty closely, and what I will do is I will go and look at the chain of title from the original inventor and how it got from that inventor to the company. Now, IP always starts with a person. So if that person's an employee, you can generally be pretty relaxed because the normal situation is that employers will own what an employee creates during the course and scope of their employment. The problem arises when they're not an employee. Now that tends to be consultants, contractors, interns, students, secondees, visiting professors. If those people create IP and they haven't signed a written agreement whereby they assign the IP to the company, then they own the IP, not the company. And if I'm an investor, I want to invest in a company that has 100% of the IP, not 95% of the IP. And if I'm buying that company, I want to buy 100%, not 95%. So the key rule is get a contract in place with those people before they start work. And I guess the third aspect is essentially making sure that you do have the right IP protection around, as I mentioned earlier, and think consciously about whether you do need to do some filings now or later.
We have established that it's not about reaching for patents in the first instance. How can startup entrepreneurs ensure that they are maintaining the value of their IP whilst not infecting the code?
It's a really good question. Effectively, it's about that chain of title issue I was talking about. And I'll give you an example. A few years ago, I was acting for a software business and we were selling to one of the big multinational tech companies. You can take a guess who it was. Now, this company had been burnt before. So they employed a suite of lawyers and technicians to actually look at the code and the chain of title to the code to make sure that it was owned, that it wasn't infected by third-party issues, and also that the chain of title was clear. They actually did a line-by-line code scan and looked at each line and each module and said, who created that? Okay, Joe Bloggs created that. I want to see the contract with Joe Bloggs where he assigned that IP to the company. And then, of course, Murphy's Law, a couple of the Joe Bloggses hadn't signed contracts or were contractors. And I'm not lying, one of them we had to track down in the back blocks of Mongolia to sign the document.
Wow.
There were 100 people that contributed to the code, and the buyer wouldn't buy the business until there were 100 assignments. Now, everybody cooperated there, but and different ones over the years, people get greedy. Will you please sign this contract assigning the IP to me? Yes, I will, but it's going to cost you. So that's probably the key issue, that if they can have a system where the IP is always assigned to the company on the way through, then you don't have to go and patch it up later. The other thing that was key in that deal was the use of open source. Now, this company had been burnt by open source code before, because open source code, depending on the license which it comes from, can have very restrictive, non-commercial, if I put it that way, issues with the license terms. So in this case, they had to rewrite all that open source code. I'm not saying don't use open source, but I'm saying make sure you know what license you're using on it, and if that is going to be suitable for what your commercial use is going to be over time.
Several of our audience members have been asking, what is the value of IP insurance?
It's worth thinking about IP insurance. It's important to remember there's two types. There's insurance that covers you if you infringe third parties' IP and will help you defend a case if someone takes infringement proceedings against you. There's also IP insurance that covers you if you need to go after infringers of your own IP, and it will cover your legal costs and those types of issues. It can be quite expensive, and like anything, the devil's in the detail. You need to actually look at what IP is covered. I went down this route for one client who was looking into IP insurance, and we were quite specific that it needed to cover patents. We went through this with the broker. We went all the way through. I get the policy on my desk, and it covers copyright, trademarks, designs, and expressly excludes patents. Now, that's an extreme example, but you need to look at what you're getting under that insurance. And I guess practically at the early stages, it can be quite expensive. So it's worth considering, but I think there's usually going to be better things that a startup company can be spending their money on than IP insurance at the early stages, unless their business model is based around actually having to go after third-party infringers.
Thank you very much for coming on the show today, Malcolm. It's been an absolute pleasure to hear more about intellectual property.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you to our viewers that tuned into this episode. Feel free to share this with your networks who you think would value from learning more about protecting the value of your IP. If you want to know more information, feel free to reach out to Malcolm or the Tomorrow's Tech team. We'd love to hear from you. Otherwise, see you again next time for another episode of Tomorrow's Tech.
Tomorrow's Tech, presented by 3 Dot Digital.